$115 million. That is what a single F-35B costs the moment it rolls off the production line. On the other side of the ledger, $20,000, maybe $50,000 on a sophisticated day. That is the price of the one-way attack drone, now buzzing Gulf shipping lanes, launched in packs of a dozen, 2 dozen, sometimes more. The math is not a rounding error. It is a ratio of somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 to 1. A planner who scrambles the most advanced strike fighter in the American inventory to intercept a disposable airframe is winning every engagement and potentially losing the broader campaign, one intercept at a time. The jet in question is already airborne. USS Izumo, Japan's largest warship, officially a helicopter destroyer and now quietly redesigned to operate F-35Bs alongside US Marines, has been conducting live integration drills in the Pacific. For the first time since the Second World War, an F-35 is lifting off a Japanese flight deck in a combat-ready configuration. That image alone redraws the strategic map from the Sea of Japan to the Strait of Hormuz. But this video is really about arithmetic. Why does pointing a $100 million fighter at a $20,000 drone quietly lose the math even when it wins every single intercept? And what does that mean for the US, for Japan, for every navy that has to defend a hull against a swarm? Stay with this, because the answer changes how you think about every naval confrontation in the Gulf and what Donald Trump's administration is actually betting on when it sends carrier strike groups toward Iran. To understand why this asymmetry matters right now, you need to go back roughly a decade, to the moment Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made a deliberate strategic choice. The IRGC looked at the gap between American naval firepower and anything Tehran could field conventionally, and it made a calculation. You do not close that gap by building a blue water navy. You close it by making the other side's weapons too expensive to use freely. The Shahed 136 is the clearest expression of that logic. It is a one-way loitering munition, a kamikaze drone with a delta wing airframe, a small piston engine, and a warhead that detonates on impact. Iran's defense industry manufactures it at a price point estimated between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit. Some assessments put the cost even lower when produced at volume. It flies slowly, it flies low, and it carries a warhead modest enough that a single hit on a merchant vessel does not necessarily sink the ship, but it disrupts, it signals, it forces a response. And the response is exactly where the IRGC strategists are focused. Because the response, every time, requires a defender to spend something vastly more valuable than what was thrown. The Shahed 136 first drew serious Western attention, not in the Gulf but in Ukraine, where Russia deployed it in mass waves against power infrastructure starting in 2022. That operational data gave military planners their first real picture of how cheap munitions perform at scale against integrated air defenses. The conclusion was uncomfortable. At high enough volume, the defender runs out of interceptors before the attacker runs out of drones. The magazine problem is not theoretical. It showed up in the logs. Now transpose that lesson to the Persian Gulf, where the IRGC's naval arm has spent years studying American carrier operations, destroyer patrol patterns, and the response timelines of the Fifth Fleet. Esmail Khani, commander of the Quds Force, following the 2020 strike that removed Qasem Soleimani, has consistently described asymmetric naval pressure as a core instrument of Iranian policy, not a side option, a primary one. Here is the part that does not make obvious sense on the surface. Iran does not need to sink an American warship to achieve a strategic effect. It needs to force the Americans to defend expensively, repeatedly, indefinitely. Every SM-6 interceptor fired from a destroyer costs roughly $3.9 million. Every AM-120 AMRAAM launched from an F-35B to intercept a Shahed costs over $1 million. The drone it destroys costs a fraction of that. Run that math across a sustained campaign of weeks, not hours, and the economics shift in ways that no amount of tactical success fully reverses. What surprises most people about this calculus is not the per-unit disparity. Most analysts know the numbers. It is that the disparity compounds. An F-35B is not just its sticker price. Every flight hour costs somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000 in maintenance, fuel, parts, and support. Every time that jet rolls to intercept a swarm, the flight hour clock is running. Against a peer adversary with Su-57s or J-20s, those hours buy you the most capable strike platform in the world. Against a Shahed 136 flying at 180 kilometers per hour, you are spending $40,000 an hour to chase a lawnmower engine with a warhead. And here is where the picture gets genuinely complicated. The F-35B on USS Izumo is not primarily there to shoot down Shahed drones. It is there to deter the systems that could threaten the ship itself. Chinese J-15s, hypersonic anti-ship missiles, land-based cruise missiles fired from the Chinese mainland. The F-35B is the high-end deterrent. The drone swarm is a lower-tier threat, so the question every carrier commander faces is whether to hold the premier asset back and trust cheaper layers to absorb the swarm, or scramble the best jet in the inventory to guarantee the kill, spending something irreplaceable on a target that costs almost nothing. That dilemma has a name in defense planning. It is called the high-low mix problem, and it is not new. But the economics have never been this extreme, and the operational tempo has never been this sustained. To make sense of the cost conversation, you need to understand what that $115 million actually buys. The F-35B is a short takeoff and vertical landing variant, which is precisely why it can operate from USS Izumo. The ship was not designed as a conventional carrier. It lacks the catapult systems of a USS Gerald Ford or a Nimitz-class hull. The F-35B's ski-jump compatible design lets Japan project 5th-generation air power without rebuilding its entire naval architecture. That flexibility has a price, and the price is range and payload relative to the F-35C, the carrier variant. But what the F-35B brings is low observable stealth, a radar cross-section measured in fractions of a square meter, along with the ANAP G81 AESA radar, full sensor fusion, and the ability to operate as an airborne command node, pulling data from satellites, surface ships, and other aircraft simultaneously. Against an adversary with advanced integrated air defenses, the kind Iran has been building toward with the Bavar 373 long-range system and the Khordad 3 medium-range interceptor. Those stealth characteristics matter enormously. The F-35B can reach targets that a Super Hornet cannot. It can suppress air defenses that would destroy a conventional strike package. It can operate inside contested airspace that older platforms simply cannot enter. Against a Shahed 136, none of that matters. The drone does not have a radar. It does not have air defenses. It does not require a stealth approach. You could intercept it with a propeller-driven trainer if the trainer could catch it in time. Going through the sortie and intercept data from multiple Gulf incidents between 2023 and 2025, one detail kept coming up. In almost every case where F-35s were scrambled against drone threats, the tasking decisions was driven by risk aversion rather than threat matching. Commanders did not want to risk a miss. The F-35B's sensor suite virtually guarantees the intercept. Cheaper systems, Phalanx CRAM, even short-range AIM-9X Sidewinders fired from deck-mounted launchers can do the job, but they carry higher miss probability against low, slow-to tickets in cluttered C-clutter environments, so the default became send the best every time. That pattern is exactly what the IRGC planners are watching. Now look at the magazine depth problem from the insight of a strike group. An F-35B in its standard air-to-air configuration carries 4 IM-120 AMRAAMs internally. That is the weapons bay capacity when flying clean for stealth. 4 missiles. A Shahed drone swarm launched from Iranian coastal positions or RG fast boats in the Gulf might put 20, 30, or 40 airframes in the air simultaneously. A single F-35B can engage 4 of them, cleanly, effectively. Then it needs to return to ship, reload, and launch again, a cycle that takes time, during which the swarm continues toward its target. A Nimitz-class or Gerald Ford-class carrier air wing might have 40 to 50 strike fighters embarked. USS Izumo, operating with the US. Marine Corps detachment carries a fraction of that. Current integration exercises have put numbers around 6 to 10 F-35Bs. That air wing, fully loaded, carries somewhere between 24 and 40 IM-120 missiles ready for immediate use. Against a single coordinated swarm of comparable or greater size, the math is tight. Against a sustained campaign of multiple swarms per day, the magazine empties fast. The 5th Fleet has worked this problem. The solution is layered air defense, not one system doing everything, but a tiered architecture. Outermost layer, SM-6 interceptors fired from Ali Burke-class destroyers like USS Carney or USS Laboon, reaching out to over 200 kilometers. Middle layer, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, the RIM-162 SM, with range out to 50 kilometers. Inner layer, RIM-116 Rolting Airframe missiles and Phalanx SARs for terminal defense. The F-35B sits above all of this, not as a layer in the traditional sense, but as a sensor node and a long-range interceptor for threats that penetrate the outer envelope. The theory is sound. The practice runs into numbers. During the 2024 escalation cycle in the Red Sea, when the Houthi movement, armed in significant part with Iranian-supplied Shahed variants, conducted sustained drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping, USS Eisenhower's strike group expended an estimated $2 billion in munitions over roughly 5 months of operations. The Houthis, operating on a budget that cannot be precisely measured but runs to a fraction of that figure, kept launching. They did not run out. The strike group's magazine depth became a genuine operational concern, discussed at the SecDef level. Pete Hegseth, in his role at the Pentagon, acknowledged publicly that munitions replenishment timelines needed to be addressed. That is the Red Sea. Now transpose it to the Persian Gulf, where Iran itself, not a proxy, holds the threat. The IRGC drone inventory is orders of magnitude larger than what the Houthis can field. Iranian production facilities, assessed by the Defense Intelligence Agency and by Israeli military intelligence, can produce Shahed 136 airframes at a rate of several hundred per month. They have been doing so for years. The stockpile is not small. Here is our read on this, and it is a take that some will push back on. The US military has been winning tactical engagements against Iranian drone threats for 3 years, while simultaneously allowing the strategic logic of those engagements to shift against it. Every successful intercept is a data point that confirms the mission. Every interceptor expended is a depletion event that gets rationalized as acceptable. But the aggregate, $2 billion in the Red Sea alone with no end to the launches in sight, suggests that tactical success has been masking a strategic drift. The system is working as designed and the design has a flaw. But here is the question that actually matters, and we want your read in the comments before we give you ours. If you are the planner on the USS Izumo strike group, and a swarm of 30 Shahed drones is inbound toward a Japanese commercial tanker 200 kilometers to your southwest, do you commit your F-35Bs to guarantee the intercepts, or do you hold them and trust the layered systems below? One choice spends the irreplaceable asset on a disposable threat. The other risks a miss, and a miss on a tanker in the Gulf is a headline, a political crisis, and potentially a casus belli. Neither answer is clean. And the fact that neither answer is clean is precisely the strategic position Iran is trying to create. Put numbers to what this campaign costs, not for the defenders alone, but in the broader economic sense, because the Gulf is not an abstract battlefield. It is a waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas and a significant fraction of its crude oil moves every day. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, is 33 kilometers wide. The navigable shipping channel is considerably narrower, 2 lanes of roughly 3 kilometers each, separated by a median zone. Every supertanker carrying Saudi Aramco crude, every LNG carrier heading for Japanese regasification terminals, every container ship on the Asia-Europe corridor passes through that bottleneck. At normal operational tempo, roughly 21 million barrels of crude oil per day move through Hormuz. That is approximately 20% of global petroleum trade in liquid form, passing through a channel you could cross in a small boat. The insurance market is the first indicator when that corridor comes under threat. Lloyd's of London and the Joint War Committee maintain designated war risk areas, zones where additional premium surcharges apply. When the IRGC conducted tanker seizures and harassment operations between 2019 and 2023, war risk premiums for Gulf transit spiked by factors of 3 to 5. A vessel that normally paid $100,000 for a one-way passage was suddenly looking at $300,000 to $500,000. Those costs flow directly into shipping rates, and shipping rates flow into the price of fuel, fertilizer, and manufactured goods in every economy that touches that supply chain. Japan is acutely exposed. Roughly 90% of Japan's crude oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. That number is not an abstraction. It is the reason USS Izumo and the F-35B integration program exist in the political form they do. Prime Minister decisions about how hard to push Japan's constitutional reinterpretation on collective self-defense are directly traceable to energy. Vulnerability calculations. If the IRGC can create enough sustained threat in the Gulf to push insurance premiums and rerouting costs high enough, Japanese industry absorbs the cost, Japanese voters feel it at the pump, and Tokyo's political calculus on alliance commitments shifts. That is not speculation. It is the documented logic of Iranian deterrence strategy as articulated by defense analysts inside the Iranian system, the idea that economic pressure on US allies creates political leverage that military confrontation alone cannot generate. Put yourself in the position of a Japanese maritime planner. Your country's largest warship is now operating F-35Bs with US Marines. Your energy supply runs through a strait where the IRGC has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to threaten commercial shipping. Your defense minister is explaining to the Diet why Japan needs to spend more on air defense systems, on munitions stockpiles, on the kind of layered architecture that can absorb drone swarms without depleting the F-35B magazine on low-value targets. The math is not comfortable from any angle. The human dimension of this equation rarely makes the defense budget presentations, but it is real. The sailors and pilots operating inside a sustained drone threat environment are not numbers in a magazine depth calculation. They are people running sustained high-tempo operations in an environment where the distinction between a training exercise and a live engagement can collapse in seconds. The psychological load of operating on a carrier or a destroyer during a period of active drone threat is documented and measurable. PTSD rates among sailors who served on Red Sea deployments during the 2024 Houthi campaign were significantly elevated compared to baseline deployment metrics, according to Naval Medical Center data reviewed by congressional staffers during Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearings. Pilots cycling through intercept missions against drone swarms, missions that are tactically straightforward but operationally repetitive and threat-laden, face a specific form of attritional stress. The F-35B pilot is trained for peer adversary combat, the mental model of a high-stakes engagement against an adversary who can fight back. Drone intercept missions are not that. They are closer to target practice, against a target that might have friends nearby you did not see on radar. The cognitive dissonance of deploying a $115 million platform and 2 decades of pilot training against a disposable airframe is not costless. On the Iranian side of this ledger, the IRGC drone program employs, conservatively estimated, tens of thousands of people across design, manufacturing, testing, and operational units. The Shahed 136 production facilities, assessed to be located in Isfahan and Kojir, among other sites, represent a substantial industrial base. For Iran, the drone program is not purely a military instrument. It is an employment program, a technology development pathway, and a revenue source. Iran has supplied Shahd variants to Russia, to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, generating hard currency at a time when sanctions have compressed the broader Iranian economy severely. Masoud Pezeshkian's government, which came to office in 2024 with a stated preference for diplomatic engagement, has found itself in an uncomfortable position. The drone program generates foreign revenue and strategic leverage. It also generates the kind of international pressure that makes the economic normalization Pezeshkian's base wants harder to achieve. The tension between the IRGC's institutional interest in the drone program and the government's interest in sanctions relief is not resolved. It is one of the live fault lines inside Iranian politics right now. So what are the navies actually doing about this? The problem is identified, the math is clear, and the stakeholders on all sides understand the dynamic. The response is not passive. The United States has accelerated several programs in direct response to the magazine depth problem. The most visible is the expansion of directed energy systems, high-energy lasers, and high-power microwave weapons, as low-cost per shot alternatives to expensive interceptor missiles. The Navy's layered laser defense system, tested aboard USS Portland, demonstrated the ability to disable drone airframes at a cost measured in dollars per shot rather than hundreds of thousands. The technology is not yet fleet-ready at the scale needed for full swarm engagement, but the trajectory is clear and the investment is substantial. The Army's contribution to the Joint Force Layered Defense Architecture, the Indirect Fire Protection Capability System, which combines radar, interceptors, and lasers in a ground-mobile package, has been adapted for shipboard consideration. Concepts for mounting high-rate-of-fire gun systems with AI-driven targeting specifically optimized for low-slow drone threats have moved from white papers to active development contracts. Here is the obstacle the US defense acquisition system keeps running into, and it is worth naming directly. The procurement timeline for new defensive systems is measured in years. The IRGC's production timeline for new drone variants is measured in months. A design iteration that defeats one class of interceptor can be fielded before the counter till it completes its acquisition cycle. The attacker's agility advantage over the defender's acquisition bureaucracy is structural, and it has been visible in every evolutionary cycle of the Shahed family, where each new variant has incorporated modifications that complicate the radar and infrared signatures that previous interceptors were tuned to track. The Houthis demonstrated this loop in the Red Sea when they began flying drones in tight formation with ballistic missiles, forcing defenders to engage both simultaneously and straining the processing capacity of the Aegis combat system. That combination was not a coincidence. It was a design tactic informed by watching how US Navy ships responded to single-axis threats. The IRGC has watched the same engagements. Their next generation of tactics will incorporate what they learned. That is the problem US Pacific and 5th Fleet commanders are actually sitting with right now. Not whether the F-35B can intercept a Shahed 136, it can reliably, but whether the next evolution of the swarm will be something the existing layered defense architecture handles as cleanly. Based on the Red Sea data, the honest answer is not obvious. Japan's entry into this equation through the USS Izumo F-35B integration changes the strategic picture in ways that are still being assessed. The surface red is straightforward. Japan is adding 5th-generation air power to the Allied naval architecture in the Pacific and, implicitly, to the broader deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific that connects to Gulf security through alliance commitments and energy. Exposure. The deeper red is more interesting. Japan's maritime self-defense force has been building toward a layered air defense architecture of its own Aegis-equipped destroyers, the Aegis Ashore system, later modified after community opposition, and now embarked F-35Bs. The integration with U.S. Marine Corps aviation is not just about adding airframes. It is about data linking Japanese and American sensors into a unified tactical picture, so that a Japanese destroyer's radar tracks feed into an F-35B's fire control system and vice versa. That networked architecture is the actual force multiplier. Not the individual jet, but the system it connects into. That network integration is also what makes the system expensive to attack. An adversary, whether the IRGC or the plan, that wants to defeat the Allied air defense picture has to defeat not just the F-35B, but the entire sensor mesh it operates within. That is a harder problem than defeating an isolated interceptor. It also drives adversary investment into electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, and anti-satellite systems, all of which the US and its allies then have to defend against, raising the cost of the overall competition further. The spiral is not theoretical. The US defense budget for fiscal year 2026, which Pete Hegseth shepherded through a politically contentious appropriations process, allocated significant increases for exactly these categories. Electronic warfare, directed energy, cyber hardening of naval sea systems, and accelerated F-35 production to maintain the inventory depth needed to absorb attrition. The number that does not appear in budget line items, but is present in every planning document, is the replacement cost if the F-35B fleet suffers meaningful losses in a sustained engagement. At $115 million per airframe, replacing even modest losses takes years of production capacity. Here is the take that will get pushback, and we think it is worth saying directly. The F-35B's presence on US Izumo is strategically important, but it is also, in a specific operational sense, a hostage to the economic logic of the drone swarm. As long as adversaries can credibly threaten Allied hulls with cheap munitions at high volume, every premier asset in the Allied inventories spends part of its operational life responding to threats below its capability threshold, or defending against the political consequences of not responding. That is not a failure of the platform. It is a structural feature of the asymmetric competition the IRGC has deliberately engineered. The question for Donald Trump's administration, and for the Allied governments in Tokyo and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that depend on Gulf security, is whether the answer is more expensive interceptors, cheaper directed energy weapons, deeper magazines, or some combination of all three. The current answer is all three simultaneously, which is the most honest answer, but also the most expensive one. Look at what the sustained cost of this competition does to the broader economic picture. The US Navy's budget for fiscal year 2026 allocates roughly $255 billion across procurement, operations, and maintenance. The munitions expenditure in the Red Sea alone, estimated at $2 billion for roughly 5 months of healthy engagement, consumed a fraction of that figure, but the replenishment timeline revealed a supply chain problem that goes well beyond the Navy's budget. Raytheon's production capacity for SM-6 missiles is constrained by specialized component supply chains that cannot be scaled quickly. Lockheed Martin's F-35 production line is running at roughly 150 aircraft per year globally, insufficient to replace combat losses at any significant rate while also meeting production commitments already contracted with allied nations. This is where the economics of the drone swarm connect to the broader defense industrial base conversation that Pete Hegseth and his counterparts in Allied defense ministries have been having urgently since the Red Sea experience made the magazine depth problem undeniable. The high-low mix problem in air defense is not just a tactical challenge. It is a forcing function for defense industrial investment, and the investment timelines are measured in 5 to 10 year cycles, not months. Iran's drone production cycle is faster. That gap is the operational space the RG is working in right now, and it is not narrowing as quickly as Allied planners would prefer. One detail that has stuck with us in reviewing this material: the cost asymmetry between the F-35B and the Shahed 136 is so extreme, 2,000 to 1 at the low end, 6,000 to 1 at the high end, that it functions almost like a category error. We talk about them as adversaries in the same engagement, and they are, but they are adversaries in the way that a race car and a bicycle are adversaries in a traffic jam. The race car is immeasurably more capable, but in that specific context, stop and go, unpredictable, high volume, the bicycle has advantages the race car cannot replicate. The Allied answer to the traffic jam problem is to build better traffic systems, directed energy, AI-enabled fire control, networked sensors, rather than faster race cars. That answer is correct. The question is whether it arrives in time to change the economics of the next sustained Gulf engagement, or whether the next campaign looks like the Red Sea did in 2024, with the most sophisticated naval force in history spending $2 billion to protect ships from weapons that cost a fraction of a percent of that figure to build. The directed energy programs are real, they are funded, and they are moving, but they are not yet fleet ready. And the IRGC knows the gap between in development and operationally deployed, as well as any analyst reading the same defense procurement filings. That is the situation as of now, not resolved, not static, moving. What does the F-35B on USS Izumo actually signal to Tehran and to Beijing, which is watching this integration with close professional interest? The signal is intentionally layered. On the surface, it says Japan is willing to host American fifth-generation aviation on its hulls, which extends the reach of Allied strike capability into areas that were previously beyond easy reach without a full carrier. Deeper than that, it says the alliance architecture is hardening, that Japan's constitutional evolution on collective self-defense is not rhetorical, it is physical. It is steel and jet exhaust and a $115 million aircraft lifting off a deck that was not designed to carry it until Tokyo decided it needed to. For Ali Khamenei and the IRGC's strategic planners, the Izumo development gets filed under Allied capability growth, something to factor into campaign planning without necessarily changing the fundamental asymmetric approach. The drone swarm strategy does not require that the United States be unable to project stealth aviation. It requires only that projecting stealth aviation be expensive enough in munitions and flight hours and industrial capacity that the political will to sustain it indefinitely is tested. Supreme Leader Khamenei, now in his mid-80s and navigating a succession dynamic that involves his son Mojtaba and the competing factions within the IRGC itself, has consistently described the asymmetric naval strategy as a permanent feature of Iranian deterrence, not a tactic to be discarded when conditions improve. The investment in drone production, fast boat doctrine, and mining capabilities in the Gulf is structural. It is not going away regardless of who wins the next Iranian election or what the diplomatic temperature is between Washington and Tehran at any given moment. Masoud Pezeshkian's government can signal openness to nuclear talks and has. But the IRGC's drone program operates on a separate institutional track, one that Pezeshkian's government does not fully control, and that Khamenei has consistently protected as a strategic asset. The gap between what the Iranian government says it wants and what the IRGC's operational posture actually does is one of the most consequential ambiguities in Gulf security right now. Most people assume that diplomatic engagement with Tehran means the IRGC backs off on operational pressure. The evidence from the past decade tells a different story. The IRGC's operational tempo in the Gulf has not correlated cleanly with diplomatic cycles. It has correlated more closely with operational opportunity and internal IRGC institutional dynamics, which is a much harder variable for outside actors to read or to influence. The United States under Donald Trump has taken the position that maximum pressure, sanctions, military posture, and explicit threat of escalation is the appropriate answer to IRGC adventurism. The logic is that the cost of the drone program must be raised high enough that Iranian political actors can no longer tolerate them. The 2020 strike that removed Qasem Soleimani was the most dramatic expression of that logic. It did not end the IRGC's drone program. It changed the IRGC's leadership and by most assessments accelerated the program's operational pace as Esma Al-Khani moved to demonstrate continuity and resolve. That is not an argument against the maximum pressure approach. It is an observation that the causal chain between coercive pressure and IRGC operational restraint is longer and less direct than the policy framing often suggests. And that observation matters for what comes next, because the next Gulf escalation cycle, whenever it comes, will take place in an environment where the IRGC has more drones, the US, and allied navies have somewhat better but not fully adequate directed energy defenses, and the F-35B fleet is larger but still finite. The final layer of this picture is what happens at the command level in real time, the decision architecture that determines whether an F-35B gets committed to a drone intercept or held back. Current doctrine in the 5th Fleet and in his US Marine Corps aviation attached to Allied vessels gives the strike group commander significant discretion in threat matching. The layered defense system is supposed to allocate threats to the appropriate defensive layer automatically. Drones going to SUS and short-range missiles, cruise missiles to SM-6 high-end threats to F-35Bs. In practice, The threat identification problem is harder than the doctrine suggests. A Shahed 136 and a more sophisticated Iranian cruise missile can look similar on radar at certain approach angles and altitudes. A swarm that includes both types, a known URG tactic, forces the defensive system to hedge, committing higher-tier interceptors to targets that might turn out to be cheap drones, because the consequence of misidentifying a cruise missile as a drone is catastrophically worse than the consequence of overkilling a drone with an expensive interceptor. The asymmetry of error costs biases the system towards spending more than necessary every time. That bias is rational at the individual engagement level. It is a problem at the campaign level, and it is, again, exactly the structural feature the IRGC has designed its mixed swarm tactics to exploit. Here is where we land, and we want the community's read on this before we close. The technology gap between the F-35B and the Shahed 136 is not narrowing. The F-35B is not becoming cheaper to operate, and the Shahed is not becoming more expensive to produce. The directed energy answer is real but years from full deployment. The magazine depth problem is structural and will not be resolved by procurement alone, and the IRGC's strategic interest in the asymmetric approach is durable across Iranian political cycles. What changes the picture is not any single technology or any single policy. It is the combination of directed energy reaching deployable scale, AI-enabled fire control reducing the identification error that drives overkill, and allied industrial investment in cheap but capable interceptors that close the cost gap without requiring a $100 million airframe to make every intercept. Comment below, yes if you think directed energy closes the gap within 5 years, no if you think the URG adapts faster than the technology deploys. We read every response, and the distribution of answers tells us something real about how the community is reading the trajectory. The F-35B rolling off USS Izumo is the most capable air defense node afloat. That is not in question. What is in question is whether the most capable asset should be the one absorbing the cheapest threat, and whether the economics of doing so indefinitely are ones the Alliance can sustain. A planner can guarantee the kill with the best jet in the inventory, or they can trust the layers below and hold the premier asset for a fight worthy of it. Both choices spend something scarce, the jet or the tolerance for risk. There is no version of this problem where the math is comfortable. That is the position the IRGC engineered, it is the position the US and its allies are operating from, and it is the position that will define the next chapter of Gulf security, whether the next engagement is in the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, or the waters east of USS Izumo. If this breakdown of the asymmetric cost war gave you a new angle on how Gulf security actually works, the next video goes deeper into the magazine depth problem during the Red Sea campaign, the specific munitions the Eisenhower strike group expended, the replenishment crisis it triggered, and what Pete Hegseth's Pentagon is doing about it. It is the operational ground truth behind the numbers in this one. It is already up.